Have you ever achieved everything you dreamed of, only to realize you've lost what truly mattered? I'm standing here today, a millionaire with more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, but my heart feels emptier than the day I had nothing but lint in my pockets. Let me tell you about the moment that shattered my carefully constructed world into a million pieces, the moment I visited my mother's tomb and found someone I never expected, crying beside a boy who shared my own eyes. This is my story, raw and unfiltered. And I need to tell it because maybe, just maybe, someone out there needs to hear it before they make the same devastating mistakes I did. My name doesn't matter, but what matters is what I'm about to share with you. Because this journey took me from the highest peaks of success, down into the deepest valleys of regret, and back again in ways I never could have imagined. It was a Tuesday morning, one of those crisp autumn days when the air smells like dying leaves and new beginnings all at once, and I had finally carved out time in my impossible schedule to visit the cemetery where my mother had been laid to rest 6 months earlier. 6 months, and this was my first visit. Let that sink in for a moment. The woman who gave me life, who sacrificed everything so I could have opportunities she never dreamed of, had been in the ground for half a year, and I was just now finding the time to pay my respects. The guilt had been eating at me like acid, burning through my chest every quiet moment I had. Which weren't many because I'd become a master at filling every second of every day with meetings, conference calls, business deals, anything to avoid the silence where thoughts of her could creep in. I pulled up to the cemetery gates in my black Mercedes S-Class, the leather seats still carrying that new car smell even though I'd owned it for 3 months. Funny how I could remember exactly when I bought the car, but had missed my mother's last birthday, her last Christmas, her last everything. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stepped out onto the gravel path, my Italian leather shoes crunching against the small stones, each step feeling heavier than the last. The cemetery was quiet, peaceful in that unsettling way that places of eternal rest tend to be, with ancient oak trees casting long shadows across weathered headstones and marble angels frozen in perpetual prayer. I knew exactly where to go because I'd paid a premium for the plot, insisted on the best location with the most sunlight, and the view of the small pond where ducks sometimes gathered. Money couldn't buy her more time, but I could at least buy her a nice view for eternity, or so I'd told myself when signing the check. As I walked down the winding path, past graves of people who'd lived and loved and left their own stories behind, I felt my throat tightening, my eyes starting to burn with tears I'd been holding back for months. I'd been too busy to cry at her funeral, too important, too needed elsewhere. At least that's what I told myself. The business couldn't run itself. The deals couldn't wait. The empire I'd built required constant attention. Constant sacrifice. But standing there, approaching her resting place, all those excuses felt hollow, like paper shields against the artillery of truth. Then I saw them, and my world stopped spinning. There, kneeling beside my mother's grave, was a woman I'd never seen before, her shoulders shaking with sobs so deep they seemed to come from the very core of her being, and beside her, holding her hand, was a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with dark curly hair and eyes that looked hauntingly familiar. My first instinct was anger, territorial fury that strangers were at my mother's grave, invading this private moment I'd finally allowed myself to have. Who were these people? What right did they have to be here, crying over a woman they probably never even knew? But as I got closer, something in the scene stopped me cold, froze me in my tracks like I'd walked into an invisible wall. The woman was dressed simply, in a faded blue cardigan that had seen better years and jeans that were clean but worn thin at the knees. And her hands, I noticed her hands were rough and red, the hands of someone who worked hard for every dollar. The boy wore a jacket that was slightly too small for him, his wrists sticking out from the sleeves, and there was a gentleness in the way he patted the woman's back, trying to comfort her even as his own small face was streaked with tears. They hadn't noticed me yet, too lost in their grief, and I stood there, frozen, watching this intimate moment of sorrow that I had no context for, no understanding of, no place in. The woman was speaking between sobs, her words barely audible, but I caught fragments that made no sense. She was talking to my mother's headstone like they'd been close friends, like they'd shared coffee and conversations and pieces of their lives, and I felt a sharp pang of something I couldn't quite name, something that felt like jealousy mixed with shame. Who was this woman who clearly knew my mother well enough to cry like this, while I, her own son, had been too busy building my fortune to spend time with her in her final years? The boy suddenly spoke up, his voice high and clear despite the tears, and he said something that made my blood run cold. He called my mother Grandma. This child, this stranger, was calling my mother Grandma with such natural affection that it was clear this wasn't the first time he'd been here, wasn't the first time he'd visited this grave. My mind raced, trying to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces, trying to make sense of what I was seeing and hearing. I didn't have any children, or at least I didn't think I did. My life had been too consumed with work for serious relationships, for family, for anything beyond the next deal and the next million. But those eyes, God, those eyes looked just like mine, like my father's before me, like the photographs of my grandfather I'd seen in old family albums my mother used to keep. I must have made a sound, a gasp or a step that crunched too loudly on the gravel, because suddenly both the woman and the boy turned to look at me, their faces registering first surprise, then something more complex, something that looked like recognition mixed with apprehension. The woman wiped her eyes quickly, almost defensively, and stood up, instinctively pulling the boy slightly behind her in a protective gesture that mothers make without thinking. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, three strangers connected by a grave and secrets I didn't yet understand. The autumn wind picking up and sending dead leaves skittering across the ground between us like nervous messengers. I found my voice finally, though it came out rougher than I intended, sharp with confusion, and that territorial anger I couldn't quite suppress. "Who are you?" I demanded, and immediately regretted the harshness of my tone when I saw the boy flinch. The woman lifted her chin, and I saw steel in her eyes despite the tears, the kind of strength that comes from surviving things that should have broken you. "I'm Sarah," she said simply, "and this is Daniel. We came to visit Elena because she was family to us." Family. That word hung in the air between us like smoke. My mother's name was Elena, and hearing this stranger say it with such familiarity made something twist in my chest. "Family?" I repeated, and I heard the skepticism in my own voice. The challenge. "I'm her son, and I've never seen either of you before in my life." Sarah's expression shifted then, and I saw something that looked almost like pity cross her features, which only made me angrier. I didn't need pity from anyone, especially not from someone who was trespassing on my grief, inserting themselves into my family's private tragedy. But then the boy, Daniel, stepped out from behind Sarah, and when he looked up at me, I felt the earth shift beneath my feet. Those weren't just similar eyes. They were my eyes, copied and pasted onto a younger face, and in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that this child was connected to me by blood, that somewhere in the tangled web of my past, I had helped create this life and then somehow forgotten about it, or never known about it, or chosen not to know. My legs felt weak, and I reached out to steady myself against a nearby headstone, the cold marble grounding me in reality, even as my mind spun with impossible implications. "How?" I whispered, not even sure what I was asking, but Sarah seemed to understand. She glanced down at Daniel, then back at me, and I saw her making a decision, weighing something in her mind before she spoke. "Maybe we should talk somewhere else," she suggested gently, nodding toward the boy who was watching our exchange with wide, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. I wanted to demand answers right there, right then, but something in her tone, in her protective stance, reminded me that whatever this conversation was about to reveal, it would impact this child, and he deserved better than to hear it shouted over his grandmother's grave. I nodded stiffly, and we walked together toward a bench near the pond, the three of us moving in uncomfortable silence, and I noticed how Daniel stayed close to Sarah, how he trusted her completely, and I wondered with a sharp pang what it would feel like to have a child look at me like that, with such absolute faith and love. We sat down, Daniel between us, and Sarah began to talk, and with every word, my carefully constructed life began to crumble like a sandcastle before the tide. She told me about a woman named Jennifer, a name that sparked a vague memory of a brief relationship 12 years ago, back when I was still clawing my way up the corporate ladder, working 100-hour weeks and treating personal relationships as disposable distractions from my real goals. Jennifer, Sarah explained, was her younger sister, and I struggled to remember her face, to pull up any clear memory from that blur of ambition and exhaustion that characterized my early 30s. Sarah's voice was steady now, matter of fact, but I could hear the judgment underneath, the carefully controlled anger at a man who could forget a woman who'd carried his child. Jennifer had gotten pregnant, Sarah told me, and she'd tried to reach me, had called and left messages that I'd never returned, had even come to my office once, but I'd been in Tokyo closing a deal, and my assistant had turned her away with some excuse about my schedule. Eventually, she'd stopped trying, had decided to raise the baby on her own, rather than force herself on someone who'd made it clear through his silence that he wanted nothing to do with her or the responsibility she represented. I sat there, feeling like I was being carved hollow from the inside out, listening to Sarah describe how Jennifer had struggled as a single mother, working 2 jobs to make ends meet, how she'd been too proud to ask for help, too hurt by my rejection to try again. And then Sarah told me the part that made bile rise in my throat. Jennifer had died 3 years ago in a car accident, a senseless collision with a drunk driver that had left Daniel motherless at just 5 years old. Sarah had taken him in, had raised him as her own despite her own financial struggles. Despite being a widow herself trying to make it on a teacher's salary and the small life insurance policy her husband had left behind. But here's where the story took a turn that shamed me more than anything else. My mother, Elena, had somehow found out about Daniel's existence. Sarah didn't know exactly how, maybe through mutual acquaintances or maybe Jennifer had reached out to her before she died, but somehow my mother had discovered that she had a grandson, a piece of her bloodline living in poverty just across town, while her wealthy son built his empire in ignorance. And my mother, God bless her soul, had stepped in. For the last 3 years of her life, while I was too busy flying to Singapore and New York and Dubai, while I was too important to visit for Sunday dinners or return her calls promptly, my mother had been secretly supporting this child, her grandson, the grandson I'd never known existed. She'd been sending Sarah money every month, not a fortune because she was living on a fixed income herself, but enough to help with Daniel's school supplies and clothes and the occasional treat that made childhood bearable. She'd been visiting them regularly, had become a true grandmother to this boy, had given him the love and stability that his mother's death had stolen from him. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed me pictures, and I felt my heart crack with each swipe. There was my mother, gray-haired and smiling in ways I hadn't seen her smile in years, with her arm around Daniel at the park, at the zoo, at an ice cream shop, living a life with her grandson that she'd been kept from living with me because I was too busy, too successful, too important. Daniel piped up then, his voice small but clear, and he told me about Grandma Elena, about how she used to make him cookies and tell him stories about when his father was little, stories about me that I'd long forgotten or never appreciated. He told me how she'd taught him to play chess, how she'd encouraged his love of drawing, how she'd promised him that one day his father would come back and be proud of him, that I just needed time to understand what really mattered in life. The innocence in his voice, the pure faith that this child had in a father he'd never met based solely on his grandmother's assurances, it destroyed something in me that I didn't even know could break. I asked Sarah why she was here today, why she was crying at my mother's grave, and she looked at me with such profound sadness that I had to look away. She told me that my mother had died right after Daniel's 8th birthday, that she'd helped plan a small party for him even though she'd been getting weaker, had known she was sick but had refused to slow down because she wanted to make every moment count with her grandson. The monthly checks had stopped coming, and Sarah had eventually worked up the courage to call the number my mother had given her, only to learn from a neighbor that Elena had passed away months ago. They'd come to the cemetery every week since then, she and Daniel, to lay flowers and say prayers and cry for a woman who'd shown them kindness when they had nothing and no one else. I sat there on that bench, and for the first time in decades, I cried. Not the controlled, dignified tears of a funeral where people are watching, but the ugly, choking sobs of a man confronting the full weight of his failures. I'd spent 15 years building a business empire, accumulating wealth, earning respect and admiration from peers and competitors alike, and in doing so, I'd missed everything that actually mattered. I'd missed my son's entire childhood. I'd missed the last years of my mother's life. I'd missed the chance to know Jennifer, to maybe build something real with her if I hadn't been so blindly focused on success. I'd missed it all, and no amount of money in my bank account could buy back a single second of that lost time. Daniel, this beautiful boy who shared my DNA and my mother's kindness, reached out tentatively and touched my arm, and in a gesture that showed more compassion than I'd shown anyone in years, he patted my shoulder and said, "It's okay. Grandma said you were just lost, but lost people can always find their way home." Out of the mouths of babes, they say, comes wisdom, and this 8-year-old child had just articulated a truth that my Ivy League education and years of business experience had never taught me. Have you ever had a moment where you see your entire life from outside yourself, like watching a movie of a stranger making terrible choices and wanting to scream at the screen to stop, to turn around, to see what they're missing? That's where I was, sitting on a bench between the woman who'd raised my son and the son I'd never known, understanding with crystalline clarity that I'd won every battle in the business world while losing the war that actually determined whether a life was worth living. Sarah was watching me carefully, and I could see her trying to decide whether I was genuine in my emotion or if this was some kind of performance, some wealthy man's indulgence before he went back to his real life and forgot about them again. I couldn't blame her for the skepticism, given my track record. But something had broken open in me, some dam that had been holding back truth and feeling for too long, and I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't walk away from this, couldn't go back to my penthouse apartment and my empire and pretend this encounter had never happened. I looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and saw not just my features reflected back but potential, possibility, a chance at redemption I didn't deserve but desperately needed. I asked Sarah if we could talk more, if I could learn about Daniel, about what he needed, about how I could begin to make amends for a decade of absence. I saw the protective walls go up in her eyes immediately, the mama bear defending her cub from a stranger who happened to share his DNA, and I understood that trust wasn't something I could demand or buy. It would have to be earned, slowly, carefully, through actions rather than words, through showing up rather than just showing off. She agreed, cautiously, to meet for coffee the next day, and I wrote down my personal cell number, a number I rarely gave anyone, reserved for only the most critical business contacts, and I told her she could call me anytime, day or night, if Daniel needed anything at all. As we stood to leave, Daniel asked me a question that nearly brought me to my knees again. He asked if I wanted to see the drawing he'd made for Grandma Elena, the one he'd brought to leave at her grave. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and he carefully unfolded a piece of paper from his jacket pocket, handling it like it was made of gold and glass, precious and fragile. It was a crayon drawing of 3 figures holding hands under a smiling sun, and when I looked closer, I saw that he'd labeled them Grandma, me, and Dad. In this child's imagination, we were a family, unified and happy, despite the reality that his father had never once been present in his life. The hope in that picture, the pure, unjaded optimism of a child who still believed that broken things could be fixed and absent, people could come home. It gutted me. I asked if I could take a picture of it with my phone, and Daniel's face lit up with a smile that transformed his features, and I saw my mother in that smile, saw Jennifer in that smile, saw the family I'd abandoned without even knowing they existed. Sarah helped Daniel place the drawing on my mother's grave, weighing it down with a smooth stone so the wind wouldn't carry it away, and as we walked back toward the parking lot, the 3 of us together but not quite, I felt the beginning of something I couldn't name, something terrifying and hopeful all at once. I watched them get into an old Honda Civic with a dented bumper and a check engine light that I could see glowing on the dashboard even from outside, and the contrast between their vehicle and my Mercedes felt like a physical manifestation of everything wrong with my life's priorities. That night, I sat in my downtown office, surrounded by the trappings of success, awards on the walls, pictures of me shaking hands with celebrities and politicians, a panoramic view of the city lights that had always made me feel powerful and important, and it all felt hollow, meaningless, like props in a play about someone else's life. I pulled up my mother's number in my phone, the number I'd called so infrequently, and I scrolled through our message history, seeing the pattern of her reaching out and my brief, distracted responses. Busy with merger, talk later. In Dubai, can't talk. Meeting running long, we'll call tomorrow. Except tomorrow never came, and then there were no more tomorrows left. I found the voicemails I'd never listened to, the ones that had piled up in the months before her death, and I pressed play with shaking hands. Her voice filled my office, and I heard the deterioration from message to message, the growing weakness, the subtle pain she was trying to hide, the hope in every message that maybe this time I'd pick up, maybe this time I'd have a moment for her. And in one of the last messages, she mentioned him. "I met your son today," she said, her voice warm despite the obvious fatigue. "His name is Daniel, and he's perfect. He has your eyes and your stubborn streak, but he has a kindness in him that reminds me of who you used to be before you got so busy. I wish you could meet him. I wish you could see what you're missing. But I understand you're building something important, and I'm proud of you. Even if I wish you'd slow down long enough to build something important here at home, too." I played that message 17 times that night, and with each repetition, I heard new layers of meaning, new shades of disappointment masked by unconditional love, new evidence of how completely I'd failed the woman who'd sacrificed everything to give me opportunities. She'd known about Daniel for at least a year before she died, and she'd never told me, had never demanded that I step up and take responsibility, had simply filled the gap herself because that's what she always did, had always done, filling in the spaces where I was absent with her own presence and love. I started doing research that night, something I was actually good at, pulling information and building a complete picture from fragments. I hired a private investigator, not to spy, but to understand, to fill in the blanks of Daniel's life and Sarah's struggles. The reports came back within days, and they painted a picture of quiet heroism that made my business achievements look like vanity projects. Sarah Mitchell, age 42, widow, middle school English teacher, had taken in her nephew without hesitation when her sister died, had drained her own small savings to hire a lawyer to get legal guardianship, had moved to a smaller apartment to make room for a grieving 5-year-old, had done everything right despite having limited resources and no obligation beyond love. She volunteered at Daniel's school, coached his soccer team even though she'd never played soccer herself, helped organize food drives and fundraisers for families even worse off than theirs. She was, in every measurable way, a better person than I'd ever been, and she'd raised my son to be kind and hopeful despite having every reason to teach him that fathers were unreliable and family was something that would disappoint you. Daniel was doing well in school, the report said, particularly in art and mathematics, showing the kind of balanced brain that could either create beautiful things or solve complex problems, or maybe both. He had friends, was well liked by teachers, played on the soccer team that Sarah coached, volunteered at an animal shelter on weekends. He was growing up to be exactly the kind of person any father would be proud of, and I'd had nothing to do with it, had contributed nothing except the raw genetic material, and then disappeared from the equation entirely. The investigator included photos, candid shots of Sarah and Daniel at the grocery store, at the park, at his school play where he'd played a tree and had taken the role with such serious dedication that even as background scenery he'd stood out. In every picture, despite their obviously limited means, despite the challenges they faced, they looked happy, connected, whole, in a way that my life of luxury had never made me feel. I met Sarah for coffee the next day at a small diner she'd chosen, nowhere fancy, and I showed up in jeans and a simple shirt instead of my usual designer suits, some instinct telling me that showing up as the millionaire businessman would create a wall I couldn't afford to build. We talked for 3 hours, and I learned about Daniel's favorite foods, his fear of thunderstorms, his habit of leaving notes for Sarah with encouraging messages when he knew she was having a hard day, his collection of rocks that he kept organized by color and size, his dream of becoming either an artist or an astronaut, because he couldn't decide whether he wanted to explore the world through creation or discovery. I learned that he asked about me sometimes, wondered who his father was and why I wasn't around, and Sarah had always told him that I was working far away, but that I was a good person who just didn't know about him yet. A kindness she had no reason to extend but did anyway because she didn't want Daniel to grow up feeling unwanted or rejected. I told Sarah everything then, holding nothing back, about my obsessive pursuit of success, about how I'd let work consume every relationship and priority until I was rich but alone, about finding my mother's messages and understanding too late what I'd sacrificed. I told her about the business I'd built, the wealth I'd accumulated, and how none of it had prepared me for the hollow feeling of standing at my mother's grave and realizing she'd lived a whole life in her final years that I knew nothing about, a life centered around a grandson I'd never met. I made no excuses, offered no justifications, just laid out my failures in honest detail and waited for her judgment. Sarah listened, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long time, stirring her coffee that had long since gone cold, and I could see her weighing my words, testing them for sincerity, trying to decide if this was a temporary burst of guilt or genuine change. Finally, she looked up at me and her eyes were guarded but not entirely closed off, and she said something I'll never forget. Daniel doesn't need a millionaire father, she told me, her voice firm but not unkind. He needs a present father. He needs someone who shows up, who keeps promises, who chooses him over meetings and deals and everything else the world says is important. Your mother understood that. She showed up every week, no matter what. She brought cookies and stories and time, and that's what made her important to him, not the money she didn't have but gave anyway. So if you're serious about this, about being his father, then you need to understand that it's not about what you can buy him or how you can make his life easier financially. It's about whether you can actually be there, actually choose him, actually put him first when it's hard and inconvenient, and costs you something that matters to you. Her words hit like physical blows, each one true and necessary and painful, and I nodded because I understood what she was really asking. She was asking if I could change, fundamentally, at the core of who I'd become. If I could transform from the man who'd missed his mother's last years into someone worthy of being Daniel's father. I didn't know if I could, honestly, but I knew I had to try, that failing at this would mean failing at the only thing that actually mattered. We agreed to start slowly, with me joining them for dinner once a week. No pressure on Daniel, no forced relationship, just getting to know each other as people rather than as father and son, letting whatever was going to develop happen naturally rather than trying to impose some instant family dynamic that would feel fake and uncomfortable for everyone. That first dinner was awkward and terrifying in ways that negotiating million-dollar contracts had never been. I showed up at Sarah's apartment with flowers for her and an art supply set for Daniel, something the investigator's report had suggested he'd love but couldn't afford, and I immediately worried that I'd already broken the rule about not trying to buy affection. But Daniel's face when he saw the professional grade-colored pencils and sketchbooks made my worry evaporate, and he threw his arms around me in a spontaneous hug that made my chest tight with emotion I didn't know how to process. We ate spaghetti and meatballs, simple food that Sarah had cooked herself, so different from the expensive restaurant meals I usually ate alone, or at business dinners where every bite was strategic networking. Daniel told me about his day at school, about the bully who'd been bothering his friend, and how he'd stood up to him even though he was scared, about the science project he was planning about volcanoes, about the new puppy at the animal shelter that he'd named Chester even though he knew he couldn't keep him. I listened, really listened, not checking my phone or thinking about emails or planning my next response, just being present in the moment with this remarkable child who was teaching me how to be human again. After dinner, Daniel showed me his room, a small space that he'd decorated with drawings and school projects and pictures. And there on his nightstand was a photograph of my mother with her arm around him, both of them smiling at the camera with genuine joy. And beneath it was a smaller frame with a picture he'd clearly cut from somewhere, an old photo of me from a business article, yellowed and carefully preserved like a treasure. "Grandma gave me this," he said softly, touching the frame. "She said you were busy doing important things, but that you had a good heart underneath, and that someday you'd come home. I've been waiting for someday." I knelt down beside him, this 8-year-old boy who'd been waiting for a father who hadn't even known he existed, and I made him a promise that I intended to keep with every fiber of my being. I promised that I would show up, that I would be there for soccer games and school plays and thunderstorms, that I would choose him over business deals and meetings and everything else that had seemed so important before. I promised to be the father he deserved, even though I had no idea how to do it, even though I'd spent my entire adult life running from exactly this kind of commitment and vulnerability. Over the following weeks and months, I began the painful, beautiful process of rebuilding my life around what actually mattered. I promoted my second-in-command to CEO, shocking everyone in the company who'd assumed I'd die at my desk, and I moved from chairman actively running every detail to chairman actually chairing, setting direction but trusting others to execute, creating space in my life for something beyond quarterly reports and market share. I bought a house in Sarah's neighborhood, nothing ostentatious, just a comfortable place with a yard where Daniel could play and a room that we decorated together for the nights he stayed over, with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling and shelves for his rock collection and a big drawing desk by the window. I learned his schedule and organized my life around it, attending every soccer game even when they conflicted with important meetings, helping with homework even though third-grade math was surprisingly challenging for someone who'd mastered corporate finance, reading bedtime stories on the nights he stayed with me, voices and all, feeling foolish and wonderful at the same time. I got to know Sarah as a person beyond just Daniel's guardian, understanding the sacrifices she'd made and the strength it required to keep going when everything seemed stacked against you, and a friendship grew between us built on mutual respect and shared love for this incredible child. I started therapy, something I'd always dismissed as weakness or self-indulgence, and I worked through the patterns that had led me to value achievement over connection, to measure worth in dollars rather than relationships, to run from vulnerability and intimacy into the safe, controllable world of business and success. It was hard work, harder than building a company, because it required me to examine truths about myself that I'd spent decades avoiding, to admit that the father who'd abandoned me when I was young had shaped me more than I wanted to acknowledge, that I'd been running from becoming him, while simultaneously recreating his pattern of absence in my own way. Daniel didn't make it easy on me, and I'm grateful for that. He had questions about where I'd been, why I hadn't known about him, whether I would disappear again when things got hard or boring, and I answered honestly, admitting my failures and my fears, treating him like the intelligent person he was rather than talking down to him or making excuses. We had hard conversations about his mother, about Jennifer, and I asked Sarah to share stories and photos so Daniel could keep her memory alive, and so I could understand the woman I'd failed so completely. I set up a scholarship fund in Jennifer's name at her old high school, supporting single mothers pursuing education, A small gesture that couldn't change the past but might help someone else's future. I visited my mother's grave every week, sometimes with Daniel and Sarah, sometimes alone, and I talked to her, told her about the grandson she'd loved, told her I finally understood what she'd been trying to teach me all along, thanked her for filling in where I'd failed and keeping faith that I'd eventually find my way. I found letters in her belongings, letters she'd written to me but never sent, and reading them was like having a final conversation with her, hearing her hopes and disappointments and unconditional love expressed in her elegant handwriting. In one letter, she wrote, "Success is measured in love given and received, in moments of presence and connection, in the legacy of kindness you leave in people's lives. You have achieved so much, my son, but please don't achieve yourself right out of the life that matters. Money can be made and lost and made again, but time with the people you love, that's the only currency that's truly finite." She'd understood what I was doing to myself, had seen the trajectory I was on, and had tried gently to redirect me, but I'd been too proud, too certain of my own path, too convinced that she simply didn't understand the modern world of business and competition. As months turned into a year, something shifted. Daniel started calling me Dad, tentatively at first, testing the word like trying on a new coat to see if it fit, and eventually with the kind of casual confidence that comes from trust and time. I was there for his 9th birthday, not sending an expensive gift from overseas but actually present, helping Sarah set up decorations and organize games, and watching Daniel's face light up with the kind of joy that no business success had ever brought me. I coached his soccer team when Sarah's work schedule got overwhelming, discovering that I was terrible at soccer but good at encouraging kids and helping them believe in themselves, finding fulfillment in ways I never expected. I started a foundation, redirecting a significant portion of my wealth toward causes that my mother and Jennifer and Sarah would have cared about, supporting single parents, funding education programs, helping families in crisis, trying to do some good with resources I'd spent so long hoarding and expanding. I met with Sarah's lawyer and set up trust for Daniel's education and future, but I did it quietly, without fanfare, because I'd finally learned that real generosity doesn't announce itself or expect recognition. I introduced Daniel to my business colleagues, not as a PR move, but because he was my son, and I wanted him to be part of my life, all of it. And I watched their surprise at this softer version of the hard-driving executive they'd known for years. Some of them didn't understand the change, thought I'd lost my edge or my hunger. And maybe I had, but I'd gained something infinitely more valuable. I'd gained a son who ran to hug me when I picked him up from school, who saved his best drawings to show me, who asked my advice about friendships and fears and dreams, who taught me more about courage and resilience and hope than any business mentor ever had. I'd gained the respect of Sarah, who eventually trusted me enough to let Daniel stay with me for full weekends, who became not just my son's guardian, but my friend, and sometimes my conscience, calling me out when I slipped into old patterns and celebrating with me when I got it right. I'd gained a relationship with my mother in death that I'd failed to maintain in life, but through loving her grandson, I felt closer to her than I had in decades, understanding finally what she'd tried to teach me about what made life worth living. Daniel asked me once why I'd stayed away for so long, and I told him the truth. I told him that I'd been chasing something I thought would make me happy, something I thought would prove I was successful and important and worth something, and that I'd been so focused on that chase that I'd run right past everything that actually could have made me happy if I'd just stopped long enough to see it. I told him that his grandmother had tried to tell me this, but I'd been too stubborn or too scared to listen, and that it had taken finding him crying at her grave to finally wake me up to what I'd been missing. I asked him if he could forgive me for not being there from the beginning, and he thought about it seriously, his young face contemplative, and then he said something that broke my heart and healed it at the same time. He said, "Grandma told me that people make mistakes, but what matters is what they do after they realize they messed up. You messed up big time, Dad, but you're here now, and you keep showing up, so yeah, I forgive you." The simple wisdom of a child, cutting through complexity to the essential truth, offering grace I didn't deserve but desperately needed. Have you ever been given a second chance you didn't earn? Have you ever realized that everything you thought mattered was actually just distraction from what truly gives life meaning? I'm standing here today, no longer just a millionaire with an empire and an empty penthouse, but a father with a son who loves him, a friend to a woman who showed me what real strength looks like, a man finally learning the lessons his mother tried to teach him before it was too late. My business still exists, still generates wealth, but it no longer defines me or consumes me. I've learned to set boundaries, to say no to opportunities that would cost me time with Daniel, to value presence over profit. My colleagues think I've gone soft, and maybe I have, but the softness feels like waking up after years of being numb, like finally feeling the sun on my face after living in a cave. Now, as I'm telling you this story, I want you to understand something crucial. This isn't a fairy tale where everything got perfect overnight. There were hard days, days when Daniel tested my commitment by pushing boundaries, days when I failed and had to apologize and do better, days when the pull of my old life tempted me to retreat into the comfortable world of business where I knew the rules and could control outcomes. There were moments when Sarah doubted me, when she reminded me that consistency matters more than grand gestures, that Daniel needed reliability, not intensity. There were times when I mourned my mother so deeply that I could barely breathe, wishing desperately that I could go back and make different choices, wishing she could see that I'd finally learned the lesson she'd tried to teach me, that she could witness the relationship I was building with her grandson. But through all of it, I kept showing up. I kept choosing Daniel. I kept honoring the promise I'd made at my mother's grave, to that stranger who turned out to be my son, to that woman who'd stepped in where I'd failed. And slowly, day by day, moment by moment, we built something real, a family not defined by biology alone, but by choice and commitment and love freely given. If you're watching this and you're caught in the same trap I was, chasing success at the cost of connection, building wealth while your relationships crumble, too busy for the people who love you because you're convinced your work is more important, please hear me. Stop. Just stop for a moment and look around at what you're sacrificing. Your career will continue without you. Someone else will close those deals and attend those meetings. The company will survive your absence. But the people who love you won't wait forever. The moments you're missing with your children, your parents, your partners, those moments are gone forever, irreplaceable, priceless in a way that no amount of money can match. I found my son crying at my mother's grave, and in that moment of shocking discovery, I was given a gift I didn't deserve, a chance to rebuild, to remake myself into someone my mother would be proud of, someone my son could look up to, someone I could respect when I looked in the mirror. Not everyone gets that chance. Some people realize too late, when the children are grown and gone, when the parents have died, when the opportunities for connection have permanently closed. I was lucky, blessed beyond measure, to get my wake-up call while there was still time to change course, still possibility for redemption and rebuilding. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it, maybe even comment below and share your thoughts with this community. Have you ever experienced something that completely changed your perspective on what matters in life? Have you had a moment where you realized you were chasing the wrong things, valuing the wrong priorities? Or maybe you're in the middle of that realization right now, feeling the uncomfortable tension between what you're doing and what you know you should be doing. Talk to me in the comments. Share your story. Tell me if this resonated with you, if you've had similar experiences, if you're struggling with the same balance between success and significance, between achievement and connection. This community, all of us watching and sharing stories on this channel, we're here because we understand that life is complicated, that we all make mistakes, that we're all trying to figure out how to live in a way that matters. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Now, if this story touched your heart, if it made you think about your own relationships and priorities, I want to ask you to do something for me, for yourself, for this community we're building here. First, leave that comment I mentioned, share your experience or your thoughts. Let's create a conversation around what really matters in life. Second, hit that like button if this story resonated with you, if it moved you or challenged you or made you see things differently, because that simple action tells me that this content is valuable, that these stories need to be told, that there are people out there hungry for honest, real conversations about life's biggest questions. Third, and this is important, subscribe to Through My Eyes, this channel where we share real stories from real people who've learned hard lessons and gained hard-won wisdom, where we create a space for authentic conversation about the messy, beautiful, complicated journey of being human. We share these stories not to entertain but to connect, to remind each other that we're not alone in our struggles and our growth, to learn from each other's experiences and hopefully make better choices because of the wisdom others have shared. And finally, turn on that notification bell, because we're constantly sharing new stories, new perspectives, new opportunities to learn and grow and connect, and you don't want to miss them. These aren't just videos, they're conversations, they're community, they're a chance to engage with ideas and experiences that might change your life, the way finding Daniel at my mother's grave changed mine. I'm standing here today as a different man than I was when I started this story. I'm a father now, not just biologically, but in all the ways that actually matter. I'm a man who understands that time is the only truly limited resource, that presence is the greatest gift we can give, that love and connection are what make life worth living, not achievements or acquisitions or accolades. I'm someone who visits his mother's grave regularly and thanks her for loving me enough to keep trying even when I was too busy to notice, for loving my son when I didn't even know he existed, for leaving me a legacy not of money or property, but of wisdom about what truly matters. I'm someone who gets to watch my son grow up, who gets to be part of his daily life, who gets to influence the man he'll become, not through my wealth, but through my presence and my values and my commitment to showing up. That's the real success, the kind that matters when you're lying in bed at night examining your life, the kind that will matter when I'm the one in the grave and Daniel is standing there remembering who I was and what I stood for. I hope my story has given you something to think about, something to feel, maybe even something that will change how you approach your own life and relationships. Remember, it's never too late to change course, to choose differently, to build the life that actually matters instead of the one that just looks impressive from the outside. Until next time, I'm sharing my story through my eyes, hoping it helps you see your own life a little more clearly.